Thank you very much, Helen, and good morning to you all here. I hope the conference is going very well for you. It's my honor to welcome you to this session, The State of Democracy in Indigenous Communities in Canada, Building Relationships and Reducing Barriers to Electoral Participation. My name is Dr. John Mee, and I'm the director of the Bill Graham Center for Contemporary International History at Trinity College at the University of Toronto, and I've been asked to moderate this panel. And before we begin, I'd just like to start, or as we begin, to honor the land that we're situated on and the people who have called this land home. We acknowledge the land we are meeting on as the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Dish with One Spoon Treaty. And as one of my Indigenous colleagues was explaining the dish with one spoon, if you've seen the wampum belt, it's a dish with one spoon because the contents of the dish are meant to be shared. You take what you need from the dish and you leave the rest there for the others. So it's all about sharing in relationship. We've got a great panel lined up for you. We've got one former chief, two current chiefs, both of whom are the first female chiefs in their community. We've got Dr. Michael Boda, the Chief Electoral Officer of Saskatchewan. And before I introduce them, basically the format will be, I've got some brief introductory comments, and then I will introduce each speaker who will speak 7 or 8 minutes. Then we will have kind of a more informal discussion session here. I've got questions, but I know you have questions. This is a very timely issue. We know that in keeping with the theme of this conference about inclusive democracy, how do we include groups, people in this democracy that traditionally have not been included? Indigenous people make up 5% of the Canadian population. But in some parts of this country, it's much higher. Manitoba, 18%. Saskatchewan, around 15%. I was able to spend 10 years in Regina in Treaty 4 territory. I was at the University of Regina, president of Campion College, and I worked with my colleagues on campus at First Nations University of Canada. And I was there during the TRC, the Idle No More movement, many other developments where we saw a change in awareness in this country among Indigenous people and among non-Indigenous. I think that was a turning point, Idle No More, TRC. And forging those relationships with Indigenous peoples. And I'm very grateful for my time, my 10 years in Saskatchewan before I came back to Toronto. Indigenous people traditionally have not been included in the political process in this country. For those of you who know the history, there was a period of enfranchisement where Indigenous people could get the right to vote, but it meant giving up their Indian status. We had many Indigenous who fought for Canada in both world wars, who temporarily gained the right to vote, but promptly lost that right to vote if they returned to the reserves. And it wasn't until 1960, some of us were still around, were alive in 1960, some of you were born much later, where Indigenous people, I think it was the Diefenbaker government, gained the right to vote. It was a controversial move at the time. Many non-Indigenous were afraid of the Indigenous vote and what that might mean in their riding. And many Indigenous people, it prompted debate among them as well. Debates that continue down to the present. Would this mean giving up treaty rights? Would this mean giving up status? How would it affect issues of sovereignty, etc.? So I'm really looking forward to what the panelists are going to say. Now, as you notice, this is an all Saskatchewan panel. I live in Toronto, but I spent 10 years there. And all of our presenters work in Saskatchewan, we call now Saskatchewan. But I'm hoping that in the Q&A session, seeing as we've got a very diverse audience, that our questions and discussions will extrapolate from that to look at the questions across Turtle Island. I think that's all I had to say by way of kind of introductory remarks. The importance of this topic, as you know, Indigenous people are among the fastest growing demographic in this country. So it's definitely something we want to get right. And I think we can learn from the experience of Saskatchewan again and other parts of the country to see where this issue is going. So to kind of introduce us to the experience in Saskatchewan, I'd like to call upon Dr. Michael Boda. As I said earlier, he's the Chief Electoral Officer for Saskatchewan. He's been in that role since 2012. There are some 76 First Nations in Saskatchewan, and Dr. Boda has supervised 2 general elections and 8 by-elections. And over the course of that time, he's learned how to build relationships with Indigenous leaders and Indigenous communities. Prior to that, he was on the senior staff of IFES. I don't know if you've heard of IFES, probably some of you have, International Foundation for Electoral Systems. And with that, he did elections monitoring around the world in Jordan, Pakistan, Ghana, Scotland, US, many other countries. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Dr. Boda to come up. And I believe you have a PowerPoint to take us through the recent history of Indigenous communities and voting in your jurisdiction in Saskatchewan. Thank you.
There, all good. Well, good morning, everyone. And as John mentioned, we are a very accepting bunch. There's only one thing you have to do in Saskatchewan to be accepted, and that is be a Rider fan. And I see that he brought his Rider hat with him. So he's proving that he's from Saskatchewan. Let's see. Before I begin, I do want to note that while I have traveled to Ontario from Saskatchewan, I want to acknowledge that Saskatchewan is on Treaty 2, 4, 5, 6, 8, and 10 territory land, and the homeland of the Métis people, and that my staff and I live and work on this land. At Election Saskatchewan, that I oversee, we're committed to working together to build positive relationships with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people, seeking to remove barriers to voting and democratic participation while moving forward together in reconciliation. I want to thank John Beebe. I don't know if there's John. Thank you for your team, to your team, for organizing this plenary event and inviting us to speak to you today. I do believe that we in Saskatchewan have a story to tell, and I'm pleased to be here with Chief Keeler, with Chief Tammy and Chief Peter, who are on Zoom with us today. And I believe that we do have a story that will apply to the rest of Canada here. So while it's a Saskatchewan story today, I hope that you'll be thinking about how this applies to you in other parts of the country. I do have a few brief slides and introductory comments before we get to the panel. I am very proud to be the Chief Electoral Officer of Saskatchewan. I've been in this role for about 10 years now. I'm just into a second term. But I am particularly proud, outside of conducting the general election and by-elections and other electoral events, I'm particularly proud of the advances we've made in collaboration with Saskatchewan's First Nations and with the leadership of the Métis Nation Saskatchewan. And as part of that, I've had the opportunity to meet and collaborate with Chief Keeler, Chiefs Cook Searson, and former Chief Beattie. On the screen, there's a map showing First Nation communities in our province. And it may be very hard for some of you to see all of the dots there, but I simply want to illustrate the number and geographic distances involved in our province. Over the past several years, I've been fortunate to visit many of those First Nation communities. I've flown in and visited places like Hatchet Lake, which is the green dot in the upper right-hand corner there, way, way up there. And I've had the privilege of making many, many day trips out to First Nation communities and to meet with chiefs and council. And my hope is that I will be able to go to every single one of these First Nation communities. I'm not sure it's possible, but I hope that we'll be able to do that. And it's something that I prioritize throughout the year. I've also been intentional about collaborating with and meeting with the leadership of the Métis Nation Saskatchewan. I have met with their executive teams to find areas of mutual interest and to discuss ways in which we can collaborate. And one of these ways is, of course, the administration of elections. In fact, the current Chief Electoral Officer of Métis Nation is also a provincial returning officer. One of my goals as we move forward in collaborating is to explore how my office can better work with election administrators in Indigenous communities to share knowledge, resources, and expertise. We're doing the same thing. We deliver elections, but we haven't been communicating and exploring our common interests. In a world where election management bodies are constantly looking for experienced workers, I think this may be an area where everyone can benefit. I want to briefly talk about our approach to engagement. I've been very intentional in trying to pursue a collaborative and relationship-based approach that really is based on mutual respect. For too long, election administrators in our province, and I expect in most jurisdictions in Canada, have ignored First Nations and Métis until we need something from them. We need a voting location, or we need workers. And I've intentionally moved away from that by focusing on building relationships throughout the election cycle. And this means investing time in the years between elections to visit those communities, to learn about the problems and the issues, but also to learn about opportunities and success stories. I want to be clear on what this doesn't mean. It doesn't mean that we should move away from an approach that's solely based on what the law instructs us to do. But historically, and particularly in Western Canada, election legislation has been very prescriptive. And election administrators, we could almost use this as a shield to argue this is all we can do because this is what the law prescribes. So what this means is that we need to move away from prescription and move toward legislation that enables us to serve our stakeholders more meaningfully. Our focus needs to be on shaping legislation that gives election administrators the flexibility to serve stakeholders and reduce barriers to all voters. What's a barrier? Well, it can be many things. It can be not knowing what ID you need to vote or not having the right ID. It can be not understanding what it means to cast a ballot, or being concerned about what questions you might be asked when you try to do so for the very first time. It could even be as simple as a voting location being in another community and not having a ride to get there. So as CEO, until legislation is changed, I can't remove all of these barriers, but I can work with partners, with chief and council, to try to address them with the legislation I've been given. As I finish up with my remarks, I just want to be very briefly talk about our approach to engagement, where I think we've experienced some success and where I think we can do some more work. A first has to do with relationships. I do not believe we would have been able to deliver the 2020 election in Saskatchewan in the midst of a global pandemic without having developed those relationships that had been established leading up to that event. I really do not believe that. I hope that Chief Beattie will speak more to this today on Zoom, but he and I worked very closely as Peter Ballantyne Cree Nation experienced a lockdown due to COVID in the lead up to that election, which meant that in-person voting was very much a question mark. In the end, we made it work, implementing a modified form of mail-in voting that we called extraordinary voting to serve workers in Peter Ballantyne communities. But it simply wouldn't have been possible if Peter and his council had not had that relationship with those of us at Election Saskatchewan and vice versa. I'm grateful for the chance to have worked with him and many other chiefs across the province. You know that we have over 70 First Nations in Saskatchewan. And actually, I could say the same thing about Chief Tammy. We had to do something similar for Chief Tamlin. A second area that I've been pursuing has to do with signing of MOUs, Memoranda of Understanding with First Nation bands. Now, Chief Keeler signed an MOU with Election Saskatchewan just this past week. And we also have signed an MOU. I believe there is a picture of Chief Tammy up there in the bottom right-hand corner with the L'Orange Indian Band as well. And so following the 2020 general election, we made a commitment that we would sign MOUs with at least 20 First Nations in the province of Saskatchewan before 2024, committing to work together on the coming general election. And so far, we have signed 10 of those. A third area that we've only begun to focus on during the present cycle has to do with off-reserve First Nations, those who are living in our urban centers, Regina, Saskatoon, Prince Albert, and Moose Jaw. Very important, and we've begun that process, haven't done that before. So before passing this over to our other panelists, I'd like to conclude with noting that I expect there to be discussion today about low levels of voter turnout in First Nation communities, and more generally, how can we change that? To be clear, I am concerned about voter turnout, and I want all stakeholders to facilitate engagement across the province, but not all chief electoral officers have this mandate, and I do not. My legislative mandate instead focuses on reducing barriers and to accessing a ballot among all voters, whether they are in an affluent suburb, in a rural farming area, or on a First Nation. My job is to reduce barriers for all voters so that they can certainly impact turnout. That can impact turnout if voters re-engage and take up the opportunity to cast a ballot. So as we get ready for 2024, our next election, this is one of the questions that's being asked. And now I'm happy to pass it back to you, John.
Thank you, Dr. Boda, and appreciate your comments, especially your emphasis on building relationships, which I know you've been doing over the last decade or so. Our next speaker is Chief Tammy Cook-Searson. And I had the fortune of meeting her a few years ago at the University of Regina when we awarded her with an honorary doctorate. And I must say her speech was inspiring to all the students and all of us there. Her career has been very impressive. She was the first female chief of her community, Lac L'Orange, and I'm told that around half the chiefs in Saskatchewan are female. So as I said to Chief Keeler, now we're waiting for the non-Indigenous to catch up. Half the chiefs in Saskatchewan are female. Chief Tammy was elected to the Band Council when she was only 25 years old. She served 3 terms as councillor before being elected the first female chief in 2005. And now she's currently serving her 7th term as chief. She's also promoted economic development activities in her community as president of the Kitsaki Management Limited Partnership. She's a fluent Cree speaker and a former residential school student, and she's exceptionally proud of her Indigenous heritage. So please join me in welcoming via Zoom, Chief Tammy Cook-Searson.
Good morning. Good morning, John. You can hear me good? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you fine.
Okay, good. Well, good morning to all of you. Good morning to the delegates. I'm taking this Zoom call from Treaty 6 territory on Lac L'Orange Indian Band land, and also the homeland of the Métis. and it's a real honor to be able to present to the delegation there in Toronto. And I want to thank Dr. Michael Boda for the opportunity to share a bit about our experience with the barriers that have been put in front of us as First Nations across Saskatchewan. And I also wanted to mention that I've always been a big advocate of people voting, because I believe that voting has a lot of power, and it is my hope that someday that we'll have a high voter turnout within our First Nations communities. Whether when we have our band communities, we have a high turnout, but when we have voting for the provincial election or federal election, our voter turnouts aren't that great, other than if there's something that's happening that people are upset about or something that they're excited about, then people will come out and vote. Other than that, it's a low voter turnout. And in Northern Saskatchewan, as Dr. Michael Boda had shown the map there, in Northern Saskatchewan, our Indigenous population is self-identified 85%, as compared to the rest of the province, which is 15%. And it is a large geographic area. And I want to also acknowledge all that are in attendance there, and also Senator Peter Beattie and Chief Heller. Thank you for this opportunity to present with you. So some of the barriers, I find that I've been a big advocate for people voting and seeing the inequities that are within the First Nations communities, and continue to be many equities for people to have access to voting. And I've talked to Dr. Michael Boda about this many times. I've advocated on behalf of our community members to have access to voting. And some of the things that I've seen there was a form in Saskatchewan that we worked directly with, not Dr. Michael Boda. It was Dr. Dave Wilkie. He was the acting chief electoral officer for Saskatchewan in 2011. And we hear about the United States putting barriers for people to vote. And this was something that I seen as also another barrier that was being put in front of our community members in 2011, was the barriers that are put there to vote. And that was one of the things that I worked directly with the acting chief electoral officer at that time, and it was on the attestation, and it's called Form 360, Letter of Attestation, because many of our members in Northern Saskatchewan, compared to Toronto, it's probably pretty rare that you know your neighbor. In our community here, pretty much everybody knows the whole community, and we're all related. And we all know who our neighbors are. We all know each other. So it's different when you have a poll set up in our communities, because everybody knows everyone. So that was one of the things that we looked at, was this Form 360 Letter of Attestation, because it used to be that you could attest to someone that came to vote, and you can say, yeah, this is Tammy Cook-Searson and I know her. And then you would vouch for me to vote. But then that was removed in 2011. But then we have this Form 360 where we can have the band book with the provincial election. So that's one of the things that we're able to do, where we have the band book, because a lot of our community members don't have addresses. And the other barrier, and I don't know who's all there from Canada or Saskatchewan, is that we don't have post offices on reserve. Even in La Ronge here, we have the highest population of our La Ronge band members. The one post office is located in the town of La Ronge, and the other post office is located in the northern village of Aronge. And even in Stanley Mission, the population there, majority of our community members, it's 2,000 population. The post office is located off reserve. So, and then a lot of times the voter cards are tied to the post office. So if somehow we can have post offices on all First Nations communities. And then the other one is that we don't have advance polls in many of our communities. For example, I was also a candidate in 2019 for the federal election. So that's where I've been seeing more of the things that need to be put in place for voter access. So we don't have advance poll locations. Like, for example, we have an advance poll in La Ronge for the federal election, but the community members from Stanley Mission, who have 2,000 community members there, this is for the federal election, they have to come to La Ronge to vote in the advance poll. In the provincial election, they have an advance poll there now. But for the federal election, and then same with Cumberland House, they have to drive 3 hours to Red Earth to go vote in the advance poll. And that's just another example. But meanwhile, there's other communities that are close proximity to Prince Albert, that's only a 20-minute drive, paved all the way. Mainly non-Indigenous communities, they have an advance poll. So they have an access to voting. So I think that those are the barriers that I see the most, are the advance polls, the access to voting. And we do have a high percentage of Indigenous people within the Northern Saskatchewan. So it's 85% as compared to 15%. And so those are the things that I wanted to mention today. But our goal is to have and to encourage people to vote, because we want to make sure that people have voting, because there is a lot of power in voting. So thank you for this opportunity. And if you have any questions, I'll answer them whenever we have that chance.
Thank you very much, Chief Cook-Searson, and it's great to see you there from Lac La Ronge. And hang on the call, because I'm really hoping we have time for Q&A at the end. Our next speaker is also the first female chief from her First Nation, Chief Leanne Keeler, who is chief of the Quakatoos First Nation in Treaty 4 in southeastern Saskatchewan. And I only met her today, but we have talked on the phone, and it's an honor to have you here as well. And I know that you were elected recently, 2022, last year, and you can tell us how that's going. And I know your background is in education. She did her education at what was then known as Saskatchewan Indian Federated College, now known as First Nations University of Canada. And she has 9 children and 9 grandchildren, and is very interested in the history of her community and voter participation, and has encouraged people in her community to get out and vote and make a difference. So over to you now, Chief Keeler. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanse. My name is Leanne Keeler, Okamal Ispoil. I am, again, the first female chief of Quakatoos. My population is 3,400, and 1/3 of that population is on reserve. I always say I was blessed with 2 worlds. I grew up in Regina. I attended public school. I graduated from Raymore School when Mom moved us out to our community. And then I returned to Regina to complete my formal education. I hold a Bachelor of Education. I returned to my community. I drove every day to teach, and I taught grade 1 to 12, became an administrator, I was principal, and then I thought I wanted to make a bigger difference. So I also served 2 counselor positions for 2 terms, and then was elected last year in June of 2022. For me, voter turnout, I do see big differences between our band elections and provincial elections, especially. Our people, I know, have that attitude, my vote doesn't matter, because we hold such a small percentage. But I think most, especially on reserve, our people are not engaged with the candidates. The candidates come to the chief and council and want us to be those voices. So whereas in the urban settings, you see them knocking door to door, you see the advertisements of who those candidates are, and we don't get that same luxury on reserve. During COVID, communication to our people was very, very limited. It was a big struggle, but we installed mailboxes. And I know that's something very simple, but what an eye-opener. To assume that all our people have social media, internet, even cable, is a really big assumption. We don't have those things. We are predominantly low-income people on reserve. Jobs are very scarce. Opportunities are very scarce. I'm an hour north of Regina and an hour 45 east of Saskatoon. So right now the mine is pushing for employment. We do have a big opportunity there. But again, we're right in the training and right in those preparing our people for employment. Again, so back to COVID. We wanted to reach the people safely. So we developed a strategy of first installing the mailboxes. And so our staff were not in any way danger of possibly catching COVID. So we did a lot of mail out drop-offs, and we were able to communicate with our people that way. And we created a system of different smiley faces. I know it sounds really something, but a happy face in the window meant everybody was healthy there. And a sad face meant that somebody was sick. And we had the Red Cross if somebody needed medical attention. We were able to look at, and we did daily drive-bys. We had the pandemic team and different zones to reach our people. So just a strategy that I thought I would mention to kind of help with this cause as well. Because again, to assume that the chief and council would be, I guess, those candidates' voices, it's a really big assumption. Whereas when I grew up in Regina, I could see the NDP, I could see the Liberal signs, I could see those things on my day-to-day. And we don't get those same luxuries on our reserves. We don't see any of the candidates' platforms at all. So I think that's really important to mention. As our moderator, John, mentioned, I do have 9 children and 9 grandchildren. I'm big in education, so working with my children for many, many years, I've always just talked about our voices being the fastest growing population. I really emphasize staying in school, and the opportunities that we do have, I promote them a lot amongst our children. We just had a grade 12 graduation on Friday, and we had 11 graduates, and for us, that's huge. In our elections, I wanted to mention some of the things we do is we do a mail out. So prior to election, we do a call out to our members to submit their addresses because like mentioned, we do have a lot of our First Nations people with no addresses, or there's a double up because of a lot of our families live together. So we do a call out to send in the addresses, and a lot of our people in Regina and Saskatoon do come physically to the First Nation to vote. And that's almost always because we have Treaty Day celebrations the same time as elections. So they have 2 reasons to come out. They have a chance to visit and participate in the activities of Treaty Day, but as well cast their ballots and make their vote count. Last election, we had 60% of voter turnout. We do provide transportation as well, and it's almost on reserve to our elderly, and we call them the highest level of need. And those people, we provide transportation for those individuals. We run our school vans, and we have a couple of our staff that volunteer to go get our elderly and those that don't have transportation. I don't really have anything else to say, but I too would like to thank Dr. Boda for the opportunity. He came to the First Nation when I was first elected, and we just hit it off. And so I was really thankful when he contacted me a couple months ago and asked me to come and speak for this opportunity. I believe I am a voice for the women, for the educated, and for those that are upcoming. I see a really big movement in our people. As was mentioned, almost half of our women, our chiefs in Saskatchewan are women now. And when I was asked that, because we're mothers and we are grandmothers, and so we put our heart and spirit into our community, and that's how I feel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chief Keeler. And it's an honor to have you here. And thanks for all you've done to promote participation in your community. And before this session, we had a nice chat about women in leadership, and I really benefit from what you had to say about different insights and a type of leadership based on service. Our last speaker, last but not least, is a former chief of one of the largest Cree nations in Saskatchewan and Western Canada. The Peter Ballantyne Cree Nation has over 11,000 members on 40 reserves in 8 communities, and about 70% of the population still live on reserve. So a little bit different from some of the communities in southern Saskatchewan. So Chief Peter Beattie spent nearly 30 years in leadership, first as a band counselor, and then as chief of Peter Ballantyne from 2013 to 2 years ago, 2021. And as Dr. Boda said, he was there during the pandemic to kind of shepherd that whole process of getting out the vote in the midst of this unprecedented pandemic. So Chief Beattie is going to join us on Zoom. So welcome, Chief Beattie, to our session. We look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Yes, good morning. Good morning, John. Thank you for the opportunity. I'm hoping that you can hear me.
We can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge as well Dr. Michael Boda for the invite to go to Toronto. Unfortunately, I couldn't make the trip there. We had a funeral that I had to attend here in the community of Deschambault Lake, Saskatchewan. So I'd like to thank him and acknowledge as well Chief Tabby Cook-Searson and Chief Keeler, the other panelists as well that are there. And to all the people that are in the session there, good morning, and I hope you're having a good morning in Toronto. I'd just like to make a few points as well. I know the 2 chiefs that spoke prior did make some very good points regarding the voter participation for our First Nations people. Maybe just prior to that, I'd like to maybe give you a little bit of background, my own background. I did, as many of our Northern people, started working when I was very young, probably about 16 years old, in various areas, but mostly in commercial fishing and trapping, and working wherever in the community that I could find a job. And for 20 years, I did run the local packing plant here. We dealt with Freshwater Fish Marketing Corporation in Winnipeg, and I did that for 20 summers. I ran the packing plant. I hired and I fired, and I kept things going. And so that was a good working experience for me. And of course, I was well known in the community because probably 75% of the local people were commercial fishermen and their families. And I was invited by the membership to run for council 3 times. Twice I refused because I said I was too busy working and I didn't have time for politics. And then in 1993, I agreed to put my name in the hat of this, so to speak. And I said I won't have time to campaign. So if you guys want me on the council, then vote for me. But I kept working, and one day a couple of guys came into the fish packing plant, said you have to go to the band office, and I wondered. So I asked him. I said, why? He said, you're the new Peter Ballantyne band counselor for Deschambault, or one of the 2. There's 2 band council positions here. So that started my political career in 1993. And I, of course, ran, I was re-elected 10 times. So for 20 years, I was on the band council, and I had a lot of experience in when I ran for chief in 2018. which was another situation where I really didn't hadn't had any real thoughts of being chief, but circumstances were such that I decided to run. That was 2018 or 2013, pardon me, 2013, because I did be Peter Ballantyne Creation Chief for 8 years. So in 2021, after 28 years of political experience, I decided to retire. And I was later appointed as a senator on the Prince Albert Grand Council, which is comprised of 12 of our First Nations in northern Saskatchewan from different treaty areas, Treaty 5, Treaty 6, Treaty 8, Treaty 10. So yes, we do cover a huge area of northern Saskatchewan. So you can imagine the distances between our communities. Peter Ballantyne is comprised of 8 communities and 12,000 band members total, off and on reserve. So that's just a little bit of my history. I have 4 children, 2 boys, 2 girls. And we've been married for 47 years. We'll be 47 this year. Married to the same woman for 47 years. So the thing that I really wanted to talk about is the interest of our First Nations people to vote in in the province and in federal politics, federal election. Historically, when you go back to pre-1960, there was no First Nations involvement in voting until the Diefenbaker years, when voting was extended to our First Nations people. But there was a debate, as was mentioned before, amongst our First Nations people, whether we should be involved in the governments of the province or the national government of Canada, because they're our treaty partner. They have the view being that they have their own government and we have our own government as well as First Nations. And so there was some reluctance on the part of some of our membership to be involved in that. But over the years, that has changed. Our population is much younger, and a lot of them are very politically aware of what's going on in the country across Canada and each of the provinces. So that has renewed, or at least increased, the political awareness of our First Nations people. And I think that that is something that is great for us in terms of getting involved in provincial and federal politics and having an impact in that area. I know that in municipal politics in the northern communities, I call Prince Albert northern, but it's southern to us. But the First Nations population there is probably around 20 to 30% of the city, and the First Nations vote there has a great impact. That's municipal politics, but
Okay, Chief Peter, thank you. You're still there? Yeah? Okay. Something happened there. Okay. I hope you're not on mute there, Chief Peter. We lost.
In the process of getting involved.
Oh, there you go. Okay.
So I think that the more that our leaders do in terms of getting people involved, the better. And our national leadership, I think of former chief of the AFN, Perry Bellegarde, he spoke to that issue that we should be getting involved in provincial and federal politics as First Nations people, because we will have an impact. Just going back to 2020 during the time of the pandemic, we had a chance to work with Dr. Boda on in the area of providing a chance for our First Nations to vote, our First Nation membership in our communities, in our northern communities of Peter Ballantine. And of course, you know, the idea of having a polling station and people gathering there and, you know, trying to manage that seemed to be something that we couldn't really see happening safely. So we worked with Dr. Boda, and he had an option called extraordinary voting. And that option, we happened to be able to make that work, where we delivered safely. You know, we got everyone organized. We had workers going from door to door with the ballots and leaving them, letting the people know that the worker was coming there, and they would drop off the package for the people in the house. And of course, prior to that, we had to identify the houses. We had to identify the voters inside the house, and so it was a huge logistical problem, but we got around it, and people were able to cast their vote, and the workers would pick up the package and you know, have it put in a sealed safe place and transported back to Prince Albert. And so it took a lot of working together, having a few meetings over the phone and so on, and getting my council members. By the way, there's 14 council members on the Peter Ballantine Band Council, along with the chief. So there's 15 members on the chief and the council. But getting all of that to work and to be something that was feasible for us to do, you know, took a lot of working together. And I thank Dr. Boda for making that possible. And so, you know, there's, as I said, you know, the more work we do, the better results we're going to get. And I've often said that to my children. I said, you can't wait for something to happen. You either make it happen and work hard at making it happen, because things don't really come to you. Except in my case, the people came to me and said, be our counselor or be our chief. So, but that doesn't often happen. And so I'd just like to say again, thank you. Now for that's thank you in Cree. Now. And I thank you for the opportunity to address the session this morning. And have a really good day. And I'll stick around on the call just in case we have time for questions to be asked. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chief Peter, and condolences again to your family at this time of loss. We would have liked to have you here in person, but we completely understand, and we're so glad you could join us virtually. We've covered a lot of topics in this session. Barriers to voting. Some of those barriers are historical. Some of them are physical. Isolated distances, long distances, difficulty to get to polls. But we've also emphasized relationships and the amount of effort and time that takes to build relationships. We've mentioned differences between urban and reserve populations. Also the role of women. Haven't touched too much yet on youth, but that's also a factor. Our session will be extended, I've just learned, to 12:30, which means we have time for your questions. So, and I know even when we finish at 12:30, if you want to talk to Chief Keeler, Dr. Boda, I encourage you to do so as well. But we have time for a couple of questions from the audience. So just if you want to raise your hand, we'll bring you a microphone.
Thank you. A question, could you explain the extraordinary voting again, please? If I'm not sure how much that differs from a typical mail-in voting arrangement. So there was hand delivery of the ballots to the elector households, and then how were the ballots returned?
It's a great question. Leading to the 2020 election, general election in Saskatchewan, Chief Electoral Officer was given additional authority to revise the legislation so that we could deliver the vote. We have Chief Tammy up there and Chief Peters there. Each experienced COVID on their First Nations. And we had to come up with different ways of delivering the ballot to each First Nation, depending on my discussions with Chief and Council. It very much was a collaborative approach. Chief Tammy determined that we could deliver the ballot safely, as we did in a lot of other communities in Saskatchewan. Chief Beattie and Council determined that we had to come up with a different way of doing that. And so basically what we did was we had election officials on the First Nation in the communities, and they met some of our officials with ballots. We sent ballots in. They dropped off the ballots to registered voters, giving them the opportunity to vote, and then 24 hours later came back and picked up those ballots. They then came back, as Chief Beattie said, went to Prince Albert and eventually to Regina, and they were counted there. So it was an extraordinary process, hopefully not to be repeated in 2024.
Okay.
Hi, I have a question about the use of languages, and particularly different Indigenous languages, and whether that was part of any of the work that was done, and if that can be seen as a way to address barriers, and how you did that.
Good question.
It is a very good question. And I would say in 2020 and 2016, we hadn't made great advances in that context. More recently, as I've been meeting with chiefs and council, we've been talking about translating all of our materials in the polls into Cree or Dene, depending on the community. But in general, we're in our infancy in this regard, but we are moving in that direction, and I think it would be helpful. There are many people who don't speak Cree or Dene on the First Nation, but it is part of making clear that there's an inclusion of those who come from First Nations by doing those translations. So our intent in 2024 is to offer an array of materials in those languages.
That's a really good question. I also wanted to mention, we do have 2 individuals that are legally blind. So we do have a support person that goes in with the individual, and they're identified through the electoral officer as being their eyes for that voting process. I do not have as much as a language barrier as the other 2 chiefs who are fluent in their communities. We do have a large population of Cree speakers, Soto speakers in my community, but they are aging out. And so we have a lot of English speaking or 2 language speaking individuals when it comes to that regard. Thank you.
Did any of the other chiefs want to comment?
Yeah, John, I can. I think it's important for us to make sure that we do have interpreters at the voting places. I know one thing is translating the material to Cree or Dene or the language that's within the community, but it is important to have translators. A lot of our deputy electoral officers do speak the language, but it would be nice to have people designated in the polling area to be able to translate for especially the elders that don't speak English, and then they can translate for them. Like in Cree, we say to run, who are you going to vote for, or who do you want to vote for? And then you kind of go through the names. because a lot of times they know who the candidates are, but a lot of times they don't. But they'll know the one person that maybe that they want to vote for. So at least, or else you can say, do you want to vote for Liberals, or do you want to vote for Conservatives, or do you want to vote for the SAS party? Do you want to vote for the NDP? So it's all the different parties. But I think it's important to have that service. And thank you for that question. I think it is important to recognize the language barrier.
Okay, we've got time for one more question. Ben, over here. We'll get you a microphone.
Hi.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Just in terms of, so in our experience in the Northwest Territories, having Indigenous, election workers, right? And having somebody that looks like you, that relates to you, that's from your community. Is there a strategy or anything that between the First Nations in Saskatchewan and you, Dr. Boda, that you're working towards or already have that brings that First Nations also, working those elections into it and more representation there?
There really is. Pre-2012, we actually didn't even have election day polls on every First Nation in the province, probably about half. And we have moved towards having a poll on every single First Nation. And we're moving towards, I believe we had 7 advanced polls in First Nations across the province. They need to be servicing all of the constituency, and that's the challenge often. In terms of workers, our goal is to have workers from the First Nation working with us in order to run the electoral process. And that is a program, this is why we're signing memoranda of understanding with First Nations, because that is absolutely what we want. We want workers to be engaged from the First Nation and involved in running the election. And by far the overwhelming majority had workers from the actual First Nation who were conducting the election.
Great.
I'll add something to that. I think it's, I know it's important, like the question about like having access to First Nations or remote communities. I think it has to do with also making sure that whoever the chief electoral officer is for the provinces or even Canada, that they have those regulations to be able to administer, because they're administering the regulations that are being brought down by the governments that are of the day. And because the regulations are in place, there's a lot of times where Michael, Dr. Boda and I, because he's come to my office a number of times, and I just tell him straight out, like, this is what you need to do. And then he'll say, well, my hands are tied, so it's those regulations. And just because they're regulations doesn't mean they're right. It's just whoever that's writing them and how it works for their community. I think that's what it is. So I think it's important to look at those regulations and how do you make it more accessible for First Nations and Indigenous communities to be able to vote. And that's our end goal, is to have people to vote, especially Indigenous communities. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. And earlier we had talked about Indigenous representation in terms of candidates. In the last federal election, there were 54 in Canada, but clearly a need for more. We are out of time. In 2 days, it'll be National Indigenous Peoples Day. Tomorrow I'm getting on a plane for Regina, so I'll be in Regina with friends there. But I hope you celebrate it in your way, appropriate way. And on behalf, and I encourage you to ask questions and let the conversation continue outside over coffee. I'm sure our presenters would be glad to answer your questions. Thank you to all those, especially our presenters remotely who are joining us by Zoom. And on behalf of everyone here, I want to thank you for a very interesting panel on a very important subject. Thank you. Amen.